Well, good evening, everyone, from everywhere that you are coming to this time together. It may be evening, it may be morning, it may be afternoon. The magic of technology bringing us all together at this moment. I want to begin by my deep vows of gratitude to Roshi Joan for inviting me to be part of this practice period and for the just tremendous offerings of this last year. Of course, Upaya much longer than that, but especially during this time of COVID, the great leap of faith into offering the Dharma so freely across the world. And it never ceases to move me and inspire me when I think of what Upaya has become for the world in this last year. So many, many thanks. I'm aware that there are people not only listening tonight and maybe listening to this talk on another day, but listening tonight who are in so many different situations. The residents of Upaya, those who are sitting the Sesshin, whether at Upaya or in their own households. And I want to acknowledge that this is the fourth night of Sesshin, a very special middle of Sesshin. And people doing the practice period, which is a month-long practice period that began in early April, studying Shantideva's great text, various translations of the title, Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. It's one translation. And then the people who just love to connect with Upaya through these Wednesday Night Dharma Talks, which are traditionally open to the public. People from Santa Fe would come and surrounding areas pre-COVID, and now people can join from anywhere in the world. So that's quite a variety of experience and situation that we all find ourselves together in. And so many of us practicing from our own homes. But I just want to take a minute to lift up the residents. I was last at Upaya, I think about a year and a half ago or so, before the pandemic began. And I've always just loved the sweet and greatly sincere practice of the residents. It's part of what draws me to Upaya. And when I think of those of you who've chosen to stay through this time, for a long time, really seriously cloistered together, and maybe some people who have joined during this time, my heart overflows with your steadfast practice and what you offer to the rest of us by being at the hub of the wheel. I'm sure it doesn't necessarily feel that way from your vantage point, but I can tell you from out on one of the spokes that I am supported by your practice there every day. And I know that I speak for many when I say that. And that you are engaged in this practice of Sesshin, and again, are functioning as the center of the wheel. So I also want to just stop and consider the significance of this time in the history of Buddhism. We have a long history within the Buddha Dharma of valuing valuing monastic practice over lay practice. I know that I fell into this way of thinking myself in the early years of my own practice. And I'll say more about this a little later in the talk, because it's quite relevant to some of what we hear from Shantideva in this chapter on meditation that I'll be talking about tonight. But it's so easy to fall into the thinking that the real practice, the true practice, is happening in the monastery. And that those of us who are practicing within our households we're doing practice, but it's not the real thing in the same way. And I think that what we've seen through this year is this greatly enhanced possibility of practice from within our own households. You know, these great teachers, the many great teachers that Paya brings, not to mention Roshi Joan, who is a great teacher in her own right, you had to travel to be able to practice with these teachers. And now we can be in our own homes and practicing with some of the greatest living teachers. And previously, so many of us did not necessarily have lives that we could put down in order to come to a practice like that. And now the compassion of these teachers and of these practice centers just overflows across the world and through the cloud to each and every one of us. I am not able to do the Sesshin and have only been able to dip into small portions of the practice period. My livelihood and vocation is as a Unitarian Universalist minister. So I am ordained both as a Zen priest and a UU minister. And it's a big job, and it's been a particularly big job in this year of COVID. And so I have been able to feel myself, maybe I'm not even a spoke on the wheel, I'm more like out in the stardust somewhere, far beyond the wheel. But I still feel part of the practice period and part of the Sesshin. So I'm supported by the practice of all of you, not just the residents at Upaya. So I'm in Central Illinois. Sometimes it's nice to know where your speakers are speaking from. And it's a beautiful, cold, late spring day. Perhaps there's a kind of moment here, any of you who have spent time in the Midwest of the country. A lot of the time it's either too hot or too cold, but there's a kind of magical moment in the spring and another one in the fall when especially the trees just are exquisitely beautiful. And in my neighborhood, which is an old neighborhood, there are many, many, many flowering trees, flowering dogwoods, flowering cherries, flowering magnolias, and they're all in magnificent bloom. I just went for a walk right before coming to be with you and was stunned by the light through the new green leaves and the beauty of the many, many flowers. But yesterday we had snow, and so I went for my walk in the snow, and the snow was falling on all of the flowers. And I've been so inspired by the haiku practice that Roshi Joan has been doing, and that I know Natalie Goldberg has really been encouraging us in. And so I was moved to write a little haiku myself. My haiku from Central Illinois, late April 2021. The old crab apple in the backyard, blooming like a young bride, veiled in late spring snow. So here I am in my life in Central Illinois, but also with you. And I want to speak, knowing again that there is a great range of people here tonight, but I want to speak very particularly to those of you sitting Sesshin in whatever form that is taking for you. I have done many, many Sesshins over the last 30 years of practice, some at Upaya. And so for those of you who are fully engaged in Sesshin tonight, I know that your knees and maybe back and other parts of you are probably a little sore, that you might be a little tired, a little sleep deprived, and that you are right in the middle of the middle on the fourth day. You're far enough into Sesshin, it's like crossing an ocean, that you can't quite remember the shoreline where you began, and the destination on Saturday still feels plenty far away. This is when the practice of patience, the paramita of patience that Sensei Shinzan spoke so beautifully about recently, a couple of days ago, I think, really becomes important. You are probably a little softer than you were on that other shore. You've been tenderized. Your, as Pema Chodron says so beautifully, your armor has probably loosened a little bit. You might not even be aware of these things, and yet they happen naturally in Sesshin. I know that you will hear my words differently than those of us who are running around in our lives will hear these words. And I really want to honor your effort and honor you. It was funny, as I worked on this talk today, I was a little more nervous than usual. And I think it was because I was aware that I'm talking to these tenderized hearts. And I admit that I have not done an entirely online Sesshin, as some of you have probably now done a number of them. And it seems even more challenging to me than a regular Sesshin, with all the beautiful forms and all the support of the other people. Be there in your room, wherever your space is, and to be turning on your laptop and connecting, and then trying not to be distracted by the rest of your life. It just seems really very impressive. I've had many friends who lived for years at San Francisco Zen Center. I was more a coming and going kind of person, but lots of my friends lived there for a decade or sometimes several decades. And of those friends who eventually left Zen Center, one of the things I noticed with them, which was very interesting, it was an interesting pattern. These were people who had been completely steeped in a monastic schedule for many, many years. And you'd think that they would have no trouble simply maintaining something like that in their ordinary life when they left. But actually, for most of them, any kind of daily practice fell away for sometimes a long time, sometimes several years, before they found it again inside their own hearts. And I've thought about that and why that might be. These were people very dedicated to the way. And I think that a monastery provides a kind of scaffolding for our lives, even though sometimes it can feel constricting to live monastically. It's if you don't show up for morning zazen, someone's going to come and find you and find out what the matter is. And so when someone leaves, they're like a plant that's been growing with this scaffolding, with a trellis. And the trellis is gone, and they have to find their own heart of practice without those external admonitions. And sometimes that takes a while. So for those of you who are practicing outside the monastery at this moment, you have that, you have found that on your own inner scaffolding that is supporting you. Please know that that is a great power that you have, actually. You could be doing many more infinitely entertaining things right now and easier things. And yet you are here. Do not underestimate the power of your practice. Before the practice period, several weeks before the practice period, when Roshi Joan was inviting speakers and asking, well, what date would be good for you? I chose this date because it's a week that's a little easier for my work than some other times. And I didn't realize that it would be the middle of your Sesshin. I also didn't fully realize what I was taking on in chapter 8 of Shantideva's text. I have loved this guide to the Bodhisattva's way of life for many years. I've read it a number of times. And I'll just say a little bit about it for those who are perhaps joining as visitors tonight. This is a text that is beloved by especially Tibetan Buddhist practitioners. It was written in about the 8th century by a monk from Nalanda, which was a place in northern India, probably a little bit like Cambridge, Harvard, and UC Berkeley all rolled into one. The greatest center of Buddhist learning of its for centuries and subjects taught at Nalanda covered every field of learning, and it attracted scholars and monks from Korea, Japan, China, Tibet, Indonesia, Persia, and Turkey. And at its height, there may be as many as 10,000 monks practicing there. There's actually a description of it from the 7th century and by Xuanzang, and it's quite beautiful. I just thought I'd read it to you. He described how the regularly laid out towers, forests of pavilions, harmikas, and temples seemed to soar above the mists in the sky, so that from their cells the monks might witness the birth of the winds and clouds. And then he goes on, an azure pool winds around the monasteries, adorned with the full-blown cups of the blue lotus. The dazzling red flowers of the lovely Kanaka hang here and there, and outside groves of mango trees offer their inhabitants their dense and protective. Sounds like a lovely place to practice. So that's where Shantideva practiced and learned. And his text is structured around the 6 paramitas, or perfections, 6 enlightened qualities of the heart, also with various translations: giving, ethics, patience, effort, concentration, and wisdom, or concentration or meditation. And that's the one we'll be exploring tonight. I figured, again, without having revisited the book in a while, that the chapter on meditation would just be, it'd be perfect for me. Jhana Paramita, be right up my alley. I have a tremendous love of meditation practice since I first encountered it in the mid-1980s. Even before that, learning meditation, but my first retreat was a women's retreat in the hills of California in the 1980s. And I fell into a joy so profound that I was completely and utterly hooked. And I have been the rest of my life. Not that all times of meditation have been joyful, but there is a deep joy in this practice that I discovered at that time and that I never lost sight of. And that retreat was actually in the Vipassana tradition. I remember in my very first retreat, which was with Zen retreat, Sesshin, with Soketsu Norman Fisher, which was in 1990, about 30 years ago. I went to him and I was talking about this joy, and he said, the Dharma is like ice cream. I've never forgotten that. The Dharma is like ice cream. We never really get tired of ice cream, unless we happen to work at a Baskin-Robbins shop. And maybe the residents get a little tired of the Dharma when you live it 24/7. The Dharma is like ice cream. And you know, this word jhana, this is the jhana paramita. Jhana is like the jhanas, the deep concentration practices from the Theravadan tradition, which I had some experience practicing. And that word became Chan and then Zen. So this paramita is very, very special to those of us, particularly practicing in this tradition. But for those of you who are reading this text as part of your practice period, really immersed in it, perhaps you were very surprised, as I was when I reread it, that this chapter on the perfection of meditation doesn't seem to have very much at all to say about meditation. Just as Shinzan pointed out, that the chapter on patience hardly mentions patience at all. It mostly talks about what gets in the way of patience. So that was a little bit of a shock. And I ask you to hold that question as we look at this chapter. Why has Shantideva chosen to focus on, in the chapter on the anaparamita, meditation, concentration? And what has he chosen to focus on? And what does it have to say to us in our own meditation practice? And this is where it gets a little tricky, because as I went further into really reading, especially the first half of this text, the chapter, I found myself more and more disturbed. Al Kazniak, who I see on the screen now, addressed this material in his talk yesterday on the same chapter, but I have a little more that I must say. And I wonder how hearing it, reading some of what is in the first half of that chapter affected some of you, and whether I might say something that could be helpful. It was difficult. There are long passages in that first half of the chapter on the meditative practices associated with considering the impermanence of the human body. These are charnel ground practices. They are ancient practices of directly seeing, experiencing, or imagining the body as it decays. And they have been part of Buddhism since the beginning and to this day. And Roshi Joan wrote about her own experiences in a Tibetan charnel ground, which you can read about in her recent book, Standing on the Edge, and on the Eihei website. But Shantideva uses these practices in another way, which is also traditional, one that we can all see from the earliest times of the Buddhism onward, to reflect on the loathsomeness of the female body in particular. And that is where I find that I must speak, because these passages hurt me, and maybe they hurt some of you. From the earliest time of Buddhism, 4 parts of the Buddhist Sangha were recognized and honored: monks, 1, nuns, laymen, and laywomen. And in some ways, these were considered co-equal parts of the Sangha. And all 4 parts practiced with the Buddha. But certainly in the text, you can't help but see that what is most valued, what is most focused on, are the celibate monks. And the celibate monks clearly struggled with, among other things, desire. And for some of them, specifically, desire for women. So how to address this? One way was with this kind of meditation, to make the object of desire as repulsive as possible. Not that it's not true what he's describing, but really bring up the repulsiveness in order to counteract the desire. But to make an object repulsive is still to objectify, just as we objectify with desire. It's very clear in this text that Shanti's language is not addressed to women, but about women, to men, and specifically to monks, and also not to lay people who loved or were sexual with one another. In fact, he points out the poisons of romantic and sexual feeling. And maybe you think, he was a man of his time and he was a monk. He didn't know better. But this language, this view that we can see here, is not at all unique to Shantideva. And where it springs from and its effects do not stay merely within language and our meditation. Buddhist women's lives and opportunities to practice the Dharma have been twisted through the millennia and to this day in Asia by the celibate monks who thought that the best way to work with their own desires about women was to reject the female body, and by extension, in some cases, women themselves. This kind of language led to the banning of women from even the outskirts of monasteries. Nalanda was a place of practice for men. In Japan, the great Shingon pilgrimage site and temple complex, monastic complex of Koyasan was barred to women for 800 years. Within Zen, we have stories of women wanting to practice who were told no because their beauty would distract the monks from their earnest endeavor in the way. And some of these women scarred themselves in order to practice, in order to be less beautiful. And under that is a lesson somehow that real practice is done in monasteries, that the nuns, laymen, and lay women were seen as secondary practitioners of the way, and still are in some places. There are places where women pray to be reborn in a male body, because there will be greater opportunities for practice. Lay people are told that in this life, their work is to support the monks, so that perhaps in another life, they will be able to ordain and really practice. And these are hard truths about our tradition. However, not everyone saw it this way. Not all men, even in their time, saw it this way. And I want to share with you a few lines from one of my very favorite fascicles of Eihei Dogen's great writings, Shodogenzo. Eihei Tokuzui is the name of the fascicle. Maybe somebody can put that name in the chat in case somebody wants to look it up. You can find a translation online. Dogen, of course, lived in the 12th and 13th century in Japan. And in this particular writing, he wrote about women and about this problem in Buddhism with such clarity. It never fails to move me. As I looked at it again today to share with you, I was once again overcome by what he said. I'll just quote some of it. If a nun appears who has attained the way and received the Dharma, a monk who is seeking the truth should become her disciple, request the teachings, and prostrate before her. This is what a person who excels in practicing the way of awakening would do, just as one would act to quench a desperate thirst. Is there anything about being male as such that makes it noble? The body is sheer openness like the sky. Openness is open. The five aggregates are just the five aggregates, however they might appear. As a woman or a man makes no difference. Women and men can both receive the Dharma. If you are serious about the Buddha way, you cannot make such distinctions about male or female. This is fundamental. And if you despise women because they are only objects of desire, shouldn't you also detest all men? When you are deluded, men can become objects of lust. Women can become objects of lust. And even things neither male nor female can become objects of lust. Things seen in dreams and hallucinations become objects of desire. Reflections in water or the sun's radiance shimmering on the ground can be used as the basis for corrupt conduct. Spirits and demons can become objects of desire. You cannot count all the things that lust can objectify. So we say there are 84,000 of them. So can you then avoid everything? If you vow to never so much as look at a woman for all lifetimes to come, then what of your great vow? All beings without number, I vow to liberate. If you avoid anyone, you are not a bodhisattva. Is this the great compassion of the Buddha? Looking at China, we see that there are monks who have refined their practice for many years and who can count every grain of sand in the ocean of teachings, but who are still flailing in the sea of birth and death. Yet there are women who encounter a teacher, receive his teachings, practice zazen, and then go on to themselves become teachers of humans and shining beings. Japan has such ridiculous things as well. There are many sacred places that are prohibited to nuns and other women to enter, even Mahayana practice centers. This custom is sanctified by its ancient origins, and people do not realize that it is wrong. This tiny country of ours still maintains such disgraceful customs. It depresses me that although even if the venerable daughters of the compassionate Buddha come to this little country, they will find the gates of such places barred to them. As well, and this is interesting for those of us who are householders, he goes on to say, as well, there are householders in Song China who have not yet left home to become monks or nuns. They live in small hermitages together with their spouses. So however someone lives, if they truly practice, honor their teacher, and seek the truth, they are no different from those who have left home. I wonder whether some of you, whatever your gender, as you read parts of this chapter, had a feeling of who is he addressing here? Because most of us are not celibate monks in monasteries these days. We have other distractions. We have other struggles than those he describes here, but we must know that we can practice wholeheartedly. We can awaken within the life of a householder, within relationship, within family, within sexuality, within a human female body. These are not fetters, kleshas. They are our monasteries, our practice halls, our ground of awakening. I invite you now to touch some part of your body and connect with that reality. This is your practice hall, your ground of awakening. Please do not ever let someone tell you, whatever your gender, your practice is less worthy than a priest or someone living in a monastery. There are many stories of Zen families awakening together, most notably the wonderful and playful Pang family. We know in our Zen practice brought to us by Dogen that what matters is our heart for awakening, not the place we live or the life we live. Please do not tell yourself this either. And maybe this section brought questions up for you about Shantideva, just as learning about the Buddha's initial reluctance to ordain women can be also discouraging. But I want to remind us all that our heroes, even our great spiritual heroes, can be mistaken, can offer teachings that they think are good medicine, but are actually poison for some of us, maybe even poison for the world. And that's why the Buddha reminded us to practice Eihei, see for yourself. look deeply into the teachings and see what is good medicine for you. So I think that's, there's much more in this chapter, and I'll say a bit about some of the rest of the chapter, but I really needed to say these things. This is really what came up in my heart when I looked at this. One of the other areas that comes up, another word that comes up in this chapter a lot, is the word solitude. Here's a few places from verse 85 in the Wallace translation. Fearing sensual desires in this way, one should generate delight in solitude and in deserted woodlands devoid of strife and annoyances. If anyone lives in a household, you probably have a little strife and annoyances. Or verse 88, living as one wishes, homeless and not tied down by anyone, one savors the joy of contentment, which is difficult even for a king to find. This could be taken literally. Perhaps he meant it literally, that to find contentment, get as far away from those annoyances as you can, and find a tree somewhere, perhaps in that mango grove that it was described in Nalanda. But have you ever noticed that when you travel, you bring yourself with you? From Dogen's Bukan Zazenki, there's this. Why leave behind your proper place, which exists right in your own home, and wander aimlessly off to the dusty realms of other lands, looking for the Dharma there? I want to suggest to you, as part of the theme of apparently what I needed to say tonight to you, that although solitude the actual solitude, times of retreat, times of withdrawal from the world can be transformative, has been transformative in my life. I believe that solitude can also be an inner practice that we can engage in. You can find solitude sitting zazen at a busy intersection in the middle of a large city. You don't have to be in the forest. If you haven't gotten a hold of Pema Chodron's commentary on this text, which is called Becoming Bodhisattvas, I really recommend it. And she tells a story about practicing solitude within the life of a household. One of the most inspiring stories I've heard in this regard concerns Dzigar Kontrol's grandmother. Her life was extremely demanding, but even though she worked hard from early morning until late at night, she became a highly realized person, practicing in the gaps. Whenever she wasn't talking to somebody, she would relax her mind and be present. Whether she was milking cows, washing dishes, or walking from here to there, she used any opportunity to settle and expand her mind. With every pause, she found outer solitude, and thus discovered an inner solitude, unshakable and profound. An inner solitude, unshakable and profound. Surely that solitude seems much more trustworthy than the one that we might find in a forest until someone comes along and annoys us. So let's find that solitude. I invite you, if you have this text, to really spend some time with the second half of the chapter, which is on exchanging self for other, which really I think is the great theme, the great melody that runs all throughout Shantideva. And this chapter has some of the most beautiful lines, which I'll close with them. But I just really wanted to make sure that you had some time to spend with them. So I think I will close, noticing the time here. I will close with these lines. And in all of what I said, I think we can take these lines to heart. Maybe we can even think of the women that have suffered so much over the centuries. I should eliminate the suffering of others because it is suffering, just like my own suffering. I should take care of others because they are sentient beings, just as I am a sentient being. When happiness is equally dear to others and myself, then what is so special about me that I strive after happiness for myself alone? When fear and suffering are equally abhorrent to others and myself, then what is so special about me that I protect myself but not others? And just as the hands and the like are cherished because they are members of the body, why are embodied beings not cherished in the same way? For they are members of the world. So I invite you in your practice, as you go forward into Sheen from now to the end, to maybe bring these questions to mind now and again. What is so special about me that I strive after happiness for myself and not others? What is so special about me that I protect myself but not others? And can we see ourselves and each other, all embodied beings, as members of the world body? Thank you very much.